Anomacast. That's what
Oh my God. Yeah.
Anomacast. As in Anomalist Design.
Podcast.
I'm Matthew Raymer. My companion here is Peter Smith. Hi,
Uh,
Peter.
hiya, Matthew.
Yeah. And we're doing this podcast as basically a service to the IT community. Uh, my company is Anomalist Design. We've been around since 2007. We've been working with web-based, both internet and intranet-based projects, with an occasional foray into mobile and into desktop applications. But what I found over the years is that I'm more interested in people than I am in projects. And of course, people are involved in projects, so one way to deal with people is through projects. And a service to the community is to talk about how we should deal with one another. So this show is going to talk a little bit about technology, but that isn't really our main thrust. We will occasionally talk about things that we do, but I want to give back something to the IT community, especially the internet-based community, from my own experience, both good and bad. Now, our pilot show is going to be talking about an article that Pete and I collaborated on a few months ago. You can find it on our blog. Our blog is at blog.anomalistdesign.com. The article is entitled The Project Takeover Blues, Part 1, The Client Jumps Ship, or Was He Pushed? Now, Pete, can you kind of summarize what we were getting at in this article?
Yeah. Pardon me. Yeah. There is quite often one finds as a developer that you're asked or you're offered a work which is part finished. It generally means if a piece of work is part finished, that there's been a falling out between the developer and the client of in the previous work, and that the work has got so far along and it's left, as it were, hanging. Now, this is almost always the case because there is no other reason why a person should change his developer, a client should change his developer, than dissatisfaction with the developer, or otherwise the developer throwing up everything in the air and saying, "I quit." And of course,
Well, you could say that maybe if someone got ill, right, that
yeah.
it could happen that way too.
Yeah,
but once you finished your summary here, I do think that there is a dynamic that can explain a lot of this, but we'll talk about that later.
Yeah. The fact is that the initial developer with the client, we assume that there has been a breach, there has been an argument, or there's been a disagreement, and one or the other of them has quit, and there's a second developer is being looked around for by the client. You will always see that there's been a gradual deterioration in relations between the two parties, and it's almost inevitable that deterioration has been, as it were, built into what is handed on to you as a technical product, half finished. You'll see what we mean by that as we go along, and how, as it were, the character of the dispute actually comes to be embodied as a little bit, at least in some part, in the actual technical work achieved so far. Simple examples are like if there's what you might call mission creep. which is the client not sticking to any agreed specification up front and wanting added bells and whistles on his project, and not being willing to pay for them. This can be a case where go on, mate.
Yeah, I agree. I don't want to derail what you're saying because everything just sounds beautiful. But you're right. Feature creep can be a reason for a client to be dumped by a developer. And that, for instance, there was an agreement upon which the work should be done, things that needed to be done. And whenever you reach what you thought was completion, you end up seeing a pile of things that were never, ever, ever agreed to, and you're being asked to do them. And in fact, you're not only being asked to do them, you're being told, well, it was obvious that these features, should have been there. When in fact, it isn't obvious that they should have been there. They were never mentioned. And you could find variations of this. Like, let's say that because of feature creep, the deadline is breached. And the client, instead of saying, oh, well, this is my fault, I asked for these extra things, he says, no, this is your fault because you should have finished it faster. And he demands more features to compensate himself for the missing of the deadline.
And also the money, the payment, it can go, well, let's say the client is sometimes wanting to get a quart in a pint pot, so to speak. The money he's got or she's got is perhaps not really sufficient for the build that they want. And this is a way of sort of putting in the shopping basket items which you haven't paid for, basically, and trying to smuggle them through the till.
Well, I remember a project I was involved in several years ago that was, for all purposes, it was successful until we got to the last week. And in the last week, the client suddenly revealed 6 months of emails from his client saying of features that he wanted done. And the client had never revealed that until the week before it was due. So, you can have blame on both sides of the issue. You can have the developer didn't really do his job and he wasn't, diligent to do his work. Or you can have the client was really not honest with the developer and he was trying to get a lot of free work. And you could explain that in lots of different ways. Maybe he's got pressure, he's going to lose his job, he's really hanging himself out there. Maybe he's just a manager for a bigger company. There's probably an infinite number of reasons that people would give for doing that. But ultimately, it comes down to a meltdown in the project.
Yeah, there is a way, well, at least a way of minimizing this sort of creep of the project into areas that were never sort of bargained for in the first place. The way we'd recommend is to, as I call it, to get as much as can be put up front before you begin, so that you have for instance, a very detailed requirement document, a clear specification document, and these are agreed and signed off, and they're clear, they're itemized. So there's a lot more you can do up front, but these are two of the main things.
Well, I think you can summarize that by just saying set expectations. What are the expectations of the client? What are the expectations of the developer, the designer, the team? And have those clear up front. These are our expectations. And you need to plan for things to go crooked. The things, as you British folk like to say, pear-shaped. You need to plan for that because in a complicated project, they always do, because it's a complicated project. we're not talking necessarily about fixing one person's web page. We're talking about entire systems with multiple moving parts. Uh, those types of projects, well, something's going to go wrong every time. In fact, I've never known me nor any professional I've ever dealt with that would say that you could have a project that got pulled off without problems. But you're right. As much as possible up front,
you can't get everything up front, but you can't foresee everything. As Matthew says, there's going to be eventualities that arise which you didn't foresee and perhaps couldn't have foreseen. Only if you've got as much taken care of already by what you've done carefully planned, you won't have so much trouble with these things that arise, because you'll have more mental space in which to address them than if you're also struggling with things that could have been done earlier. The main changing the subject a bit now, the main thing about relationships between client and new developer on project takeovers is that you must be a bit cautious. At least the developer must be a bit cautious, because it's possible, it's 50-50 at least, that the client you're dealing with has been instrumental in the rift that previously occurred between this former developer and himself.
Yes. Yeah. I don't think that, to be fair, anytime a project falls apart, there's blame on both sides. And I know that this is a difficult thing for human beings to do. If you're going to hold a project together, I think you need to stop thinking about whose fault it is. You need to think about the project itself. How do we make this project successful? What is it that every person needs in order for this project to be successful? And that's how you resolve a rift. You resolve it by talking about it and communicating about it.
Yeah.
But, that's difficult. But that's the only way I know it to work it out.
Yeah. Anyhow, you got to be aware that there's probably been a human relations, what should we say, earth tremor somewhere along the line. These are the sort of things that destroy relationships rather than technical things.
Yeah, absolutely.
The way to get yourself on track if you're handed a part finished project, you can try and approach the previous developer. You never know. It's certainly worth trying to approach the former developer if you can find out who he was, who she was, and seeing if you can get any information from them, both perhaps mainly technical, but also about the client himself. You give you an idea of what you're letting yourself in for, how you're going to have to handle the person. But certainly, sometimes the old developer will just say no, he doesn't want anyone, wash his hands of it. But quite often, on the other hand, they might be more sympathetic to you because you're a developer yourself. So you might get some sort of rapport going.
Well, and you realize that in a corporate, larger scale project, even if you're going to have a switchover, there has to be a transition, and that in your initial agreements, there has to be a policy for switching teams. There has to be a policy for that. You would be out of your mind not to have one in a big project.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it would behoove the developer, unless he dies, that he will be paid to transition in the new team. That's just the way it has to be. You can't expect the developer or his company to do that for free. And this is something else a client needs to keep in mind, that you just can't fire them, because that's insane. You're jeopardizing your project if you do that. You have to have a policy up front. If we decide we don't like one another, this is what we're going to do. We're going to have a switchover, and all of that switchover begins even before the switchover happens. A big project has to have code reviews by an independent party, so that there are no backdoors being placed in the system. There's nothing untoward going on that would derail your system on switchover. And the old team has to be available for so many months or weeks, depending on how big the project is, and they have to be paid for that. That way, everything stays professional and not turn into a bloody, gladiatorial game.
Yeah, and to be fair to clients, that there are quite a few developers who may well be overmatched by a project once they get to grips with it. There may be developers who don't deliver on time, don't deliver milestones on time consistently. So there are problems that arise on the developing side which can cause a rift, and it's not always just about character. There are sort of technical things in the mix which can exacerbate the relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually see this, and this is something I referred to earlier. I actually see this as probably one of the most prevalent and difficult issues in the IT community. I know in my 15 years of doing this, 15 or 16 years of doing this, I've taken over a half a dozen projects. And most of them have been successful in the takeover process. Some of them have been absolute disaster in the takeover process. So much so that each time I take over a project, I increase my prices for that, that process of taking over something. It's very stressful. And I cannot think, in all of those projects, I can only think of one that the developer was actually available to answer questions. And these projects were not small. All of them were big. Multiple months, multiple years projects. And I find it humorous, even for corporate clients, that they are very naive about how easy it is to switch over. The benchmark that some of my friends who work for very large corporations is this: if you're going to switch a team, how long will it take that team to completely take over the project? Will be the same amount of time it took the first team to get to the point that you wanted to take someone else to take it over. Which means if it was a 3-year project, expect that the system won't be stable for about 3 years. Because you can't undo 3 years of work. You can't figure out 3 years. Now, this is, again, I'm saying this on projects that were not properly documented. There was no independent code review. And I have never, in 15 years, even for large projects that made lots of money, found a project that was properly documented and had been reviewed by an independent third party.
And of course, you'll only, if you approach the former the client and not the former developer, you will get only one side of the story. You'll get in the course of nature, you will get a coloured version of the story. You will get the story from this point of view, and it will be hard to get balance unless you can get access to the forward developer to see what the other side of the story is from his point of view.
Absolutely, Pete, absolutely. And if you were going to get it from the developer's side, you would hear his side of the story.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, yes.
And that's another criteria that I've said. If I were ever to take over another system, which I'm not so sure I would want to right now, but if I were ever to do it, I would have to have a complete audit of all the email communication that was relevant to that project for the whole project period, because I want to know what went on. I want to know all the politics that were involved, because, well, I think I've illustrated it to you in another conversation this way. The client may be asking you to walk in a field. Is it a field of daisy? Is it a field of manure? Or is it a field of landmines? And usually in a project takeover, it's a field of landmines. And yeah, I mean,
can I give you a scenario, particularly about the bigger projects Matthew was talking about? You have a middleman, or a middle person between the client and you, the developer. You have a broker, part technical, part admin business, and this chap or woman is caught in the middle. They have the pressures from the client put upon them, and have to handle the other side, the technical aspects, which are recalcitrant and take a bit of time to resolve. You'll find a typical scenario is the developer will talk to the middle person and say, this can't be done this way, it can be done this way. He or she will go back to the client, and the client will say, we want it done this way, not the other way. And that's a simple example, but this is a recipe for confusion and disaster.
And go ahead, Pete. Go ahead.
When you have a big project, you have a lot riding on it. You have clients who've got the purse strings and feel sometimes that they can just demand what they like, whether it's physically possible or virtually possible or not, simply because they feel they can anyway, and they can demand it. But sometimes it's just not on the shelf. It's not on the shelf, and it's not tailor makeable.
Look, for instance, I've had this happen many times, that you have that middleman and you've explained to the middleman what it is possible, and just like you said, they went, the client's contradicted it, he's come back and said you have to give it, but he didn't bother to budget for the time and the staff to do it. He expected it to be done for free. Well, why? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. You don't build a house that way, do you? I mean, you don't ask and say, well, I know that the building diagram, the blueprints say it has 4 bedrooms, but I'd like 8.
Yeah.
Well, what's an architect or an engineer going to say to you? He's going to say you're crazy. You got to pay, we're going to have to go back to square one. We're going to have to add, change the blueprints. We're going to have to go get new permits. You're going to have to pay more for that work. But in software projects, somehow it never seems to come out that clear. It's like there's some sort of magic to software that, that somehow you're supposed to, just wave a wand and come up with this simplified solution. And it's not that way.
I would like to express it is that the client knows how to turn on the television, change the channel, volume, contrast, even move the aerial about until to get a better reception, and but knows nothing about the cathode ray tube or whatever it is, the plasma screen, the bits and pieces, the gubbins inside, how it works electronically. Couldn't repair it, couldn't build one, couldn't even give an overview, a rough overview of how a picture is created on the screen. And so in this sense, I'm not saying this in a pejorative sense, but he's ignorant in this sense that he doesn't know technically what a television is. He only knows how to use it, and so the expectations when he's buying a television, as it were, made to measure, made specifically for him with all the features he wants on it, his expectations can go wherever they like without taking into account any technical features, whether they're possible or not, whether they're desirable or not, whether they're going to interfere with other features or not. Of course, if you have a particularly large client who are pretty used to getting their own way in business, you're going to end up in an impasse pretty quickly if this is the attitude that what I say goes and what I want I get, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, whenever you get in that situation and you are the vendor, and this is a significant part of your income, and maybe it's all your income, maybe it's 100%. Now you could stand on principle and walk out the door, but that's not very likely because you know they're holding on to you. It's a very rare and exceptional person who can do that. What will happen whenever you're put in this unfair position that they're asking you to do something, you're like, man, we just don't have the resources to do that. And that was never in the agreement, but they're holding this clause in the contract that they can quit for any cause, but we need this money. So what do? Well, you cut corners. You cheat. You do anything to make it work. You even do dangerous things that might later blow up. So what's the client doing whenever he's being a goon about it, right? Is he helping himself whenever he's doing that? Or is he hurting himself?
This is interesting, that this relationship, this inequitable relationship between developer and client developer is important, because not just with big projects, but quite a lot of projects, you get the idea with as it were, when you buy a product from a developer, or buy the developer's time and resources to build a product, some people will believe that they're buying some sort of claim on the freedom and discretion of the developer, on the time of the developer, over almost like a mortgage on his life, as it were.
Yeah. Oh, I've often compared it to Mephistopheles.
Go on, Matt.
You know, I mean, the developer says, "Oh, I want to have a good client. I want to have a great career. I want to have this in my portfolio. I'll do anything for this." And he sells his soul for the project.
Yeah. The fact it leads to, you know, this, if there is an overbearing client who is one who feels he's buying more than just resources and a set amount of time and know-how, you will struggle all the way through with this, as it were, assumption of an inequitable relationship, whereby you've got the client feeling that he's entitled to manage and boss and interfere, even in your own, even in the.
lost you. Well, I don't know. Lost Pete.
Sorry. And with his personnel, interfere with his personnel and the developers' personnel, and have all sorts of what are really intrusions and insubordinate activities going on, and won't accept that the relationship ought to be equitable, because the best results come when people listen to each other.
That's right. And that's part 2 of the series, isn't it? Finding a balance.
Yeah.
And I don't know, how long have we been going here? We've been going 45 minutes already?
I can't remember when we started, Matt. So.
I can't remember either. I think I've been really happy with this, but I don't want this to spiral on forever. And we are going to do this again in the future. Okay. Everybody who's listened, and I know this is our pilot episode, and we've only got one live viewer right now.
Yeah.
But that's great. I'm glad we've got one live viewer. Mr. Kwa, I assume is in China or Hong Kong or Taiwan. And I did say your name correctly. I think it's Kwa.
Hi, Kwa.
Yeah, Kwa. Yeah, I had a classmate in high school that was a Kwa. The show in the future is going to deal not only with this concept of a project takeover, but with, I believe, some healthy community things that relate outside of the IT community, that relate to the life and health of people working in the IT industry and in other industries. I'm not going to harp too much on what my business does, but at least in the pilot episode, I am going to say that we've been involved in web design, web development for 15 years. We've seen all sorts of things. At present, we're specializing in custom responsive WordPress themes, but we're not only restricted to that. We do have experience in the closed source world with Microsoft ASP.NET. We've worked with Python projects. We've worked with iOS. We've worked with Android. We've got a great group of consultants out there that we deal with. And as I get older, I want to deal more with consulting people on how to interact with their clients, how to interact with their vendors. I think that this is a healthy place for us to go. Well, Pete, thanks. And I will be stopping the broadcast now, and we can talk offline about how this went.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.